We have in all three of our readings very foreboding things happening. Warnings in 1 Samuel and warnings in Acts. If you remember, I preached on the Acts passage last August, which I found out today is not online. But looked back, and the passage there is about the promises that we make. Remember, the last 2 weeks we've been talking about the promises that have been made. 2 weeks ago was Paul talking to the Corinthians about a gift that was being offered to the Macedonian church. He said, it's been a year, you better remember. It's been a year, you better remember. And then last week we talked about how the people, after Paul had left, were starting to complain about the commands that he had given them, the teachings that he had given them. That they thought, well, I like this one, but I don't like this one. I like this one, and I don't like this one. And hey, I have this really cool idea from this other religion. Let's pull that in. And Paul's like, no, you can't do that. You got to obey what God is asking you to do. You got to obey what God's command is. And when we get to this passage in Acts, as I said before, the thing wasn't that they didn't give the amount of money. God would have been perfectly happy with the amount of money that they did give. The problem was that they wanted to give only part of the money, but to get the glory of giving all of it. They wanted to get complete glory for only partial obedience. God didn't ask them to sell their property. They were looking for some glory. God didn't ask Phineas and Hophni to bring the Ark of the Covenant to the battlefield. They wanted to do it to get themselves glory. They did it for themselves, not for God. Ananias and Sapphira didn't give the money for themselves, for God. They did it for themselves. Your attitude needs to be in the right place. Phineas and Hophni were mixing up things when they brought the ark out into the field. Ananias and Sapphira weren't telling the whole truth when they laid the money in front of Peter. Remember, we've been talking about the last several weeks about the commitments that people have made. For Ananias and Sapphira, their commitment was to give all this money they sold from selling a field, to lay all this money at the apostles' feet. But they decided something may have come up, something real may have come up. They may have had some bill that came up. They may have had some problem that came up that they couldn't lay all the money at the apostles' feet. God would have forgiven them. They had to be truthful about it. They weren't truthful about it. Phineas and Hophni just wanted glory for themselves. They wanted to do things their own way. They thought that they could go about it. They've been doing it for a long time up to this point in 1 Samuel chapter 4. They've been making mistake after mistake after mistake and getting away with it. They were like a spoiled child who becomes a spoiled teenager who becomes a really rowdy adult, thinking they can do whatever they want. And the only end that was possible for them was this violent end. The only end that was possible for them was this. It was prophesied just in the previous chapter. That there was no hope for them. But we have the hope that we saw in Luke chapter 20. Through that whole first portion of that passage, it's all gloom and doom, gloom and doom, gloom and doom. But at the end of it is our hope. Turn with me, if you will, to Luke chapter 20. Beginning at verse 25, we're talking about all the bad things that will happen. There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea. Men will faint from terror, apprehensive of what is coming on the world, for the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time they will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. when things look the worst, we have the greatest hope that our redemption is drawing near. We need to learn from the mistakes of others. We know from Phineas and Hophni that we can't take things into our own hands. To do things differently than the way God has asked them to occur. To say, I have this great idea. Let's try this. And not have prayed about it. And not be within the will of God. To be doing things totally against God's will and still standing up and expecting his blessing. That's not going to happen. To be like Ananias and Sapphira, to sell their property and to give a lot of money. It was probably still a lot of money that they gave. But doing it for their own glory, and in so doing, lying to God. From these four, we can learn a lot. We can learn a lot about what our attitude is when we go about and do the work of God. What our attitude is when we go out and are representative of God. See, the problem with Hophni and Phineas wasn't simply that they messed up. It's that they messed up and they were leaders. People looked up to them. They said, I want to be like them. They're men of God. We must follow their example. And so the result had to be even much worse. That's the sad news, that sometimes it takes something big before people learn. And we do need to learn that Jesus Christ has laid down his life so that we have hope. And that it's not cheap grace. It's not that we can do whatever we want, do whatever bad we want, to do things our own way, to throw this in and that in, and this in and that in. But instead we follow the commands that we have received because we're so grateful for the death that Jesus Christ died on the cross and the free gift that he has given to us. Not cheap, but it's a free gift. All we have to do is receive it. Our response in love will be to obey the commands and the mandates God has given us so that we're not like Phineas and Hophni and we're not like Ananias and Sapphira, but rather we may be those who, when things get bad, when things get worse, that we may lift up our heads and know that our redemption is drawing near.